Chinese have finally sort of admitted their population shrank for the first time in 2022. And that was the first time in 60 years, losing 750,000 plus people as deaths outstrip births. That some of that's due to COVID, but also the same problems we're seeing even in the United States. Young people who do get married are doing so later. A lot of people don't want to get married or can't because there's nobody to marry. And the number of women of childbearing age, I guess, which is 15 to 49, which is a little creepy, but I guess technically true, is also falling because of what, the one child policy? Is that why that's falling?
So the one child policy sped things up. It made things actually a lot worse for China. Chinese birth rates were already in decline. That one child policy, and this is something that people always have to remember, public policy tends to lag behind what's happening in the private sector, what's happening in our everyday lives. So the birth rate was already starting to dip in China, and then the central government decided to speed it up. And they put in place this one child policy, which, at the time probably sounded like a great idea, but now seems like complete folly. Like, what the heck were you guys thinking? Because it turned off not one, but two generations to having kids.
And it did it at the time where their economy was enjoying this massive boon, right? So
this
at the time
amazing middle class.
Yeah, like, oh, we should have 3 kids because we finally got a job and we're manufacturing, and look, we're earning 5 times as much as we were. Oh, but we can't because there's a law. And now my Chinese friends, who, again, people who live in China, are like, I'm not going to have kids. And most of my teachers actually are women, and they say things like, "There's no guys," and I'm thinking, there's only guys.
There's a ton of guys.
There's only guys. And they're like, well, I don't need to because I have a job and I can take care of myself. And the guys I know are gross, or they're too traditional. And they got the same problem, right? With these women, they have jobs, and then they go, the guys around me are gross, which is something everybody says when they're dating. And then they were also one child. So the idea that they're going to have like 4 kids now is just complete insanity. They're just not going to do it.
So you want to know something fun about demographics is we can often find correlation and causation to things that might not seem to be connected. And in China, like here in the United States, it's often around disposable income. So we can take a look at other things that they're buying, and it can indicate perhaps how their birth rate is dropping. So pet ownership, for example, as pet ownership goes up, the birth rate drops. As people order out food more, the birth rate drops. As people buy luxury goods, the birth rate drops. It signals that people aren't necessarily spending time, energy, or money on having kids. They'd rather spend it on themselves or their partner.
And they've got the same, that actually makes sense, right? If you're a cat daddy, you don't necessarily need kids, especially if you mentioned that youth unemployment at 20%. Housing in China, also super expensive. I mean, and I'm not just talking about Shanghai where it's the same price as New York or California or whatever, but education is super expensive. And I don't know how many people know this. I'm sure you do. But when you're Chinese and your parents are old, their retirement plan is they're living off of you / with you. So if you marry somebody, you've got 4 elderly parents living in your house at some point. The idea that you're then going to have 1 or 2 or 3 kids, who can afford that? Nobody. Yeah. Nobody.
Yeah, it's basically a law of filial piety where the adult children take care of mom and dad. Now, what's interesting about that is this is where China's kind of disconnected in their public policy versus for what they actually did. So they have this rule that you are required as an adult child to take care of your parents. That is actually a law.
Mm-hmm. I did not know it was a law.
The problem is they've actually moved people away from their parents. So you could be from an a Western province in China, living on the coast in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, even in Beijing. You are still required to take care of your mom and dad. You're required to see them. You're required to visit them on a regular basis. Think of the burden that puts on an individual. I mean, I'm in DC. My parents are in Pittsburgh. I want to see them on a regular basis. It's hard just to get there. Now imagine traveling, across this country, because we're roughly about the same width. Imagine your parents are in San Francisco and you're in New York City and having to do that trip on a regular basis. That would be hard, especially because things don't get easier as our parents age. They tend to get much more difficult.
Right, and they have that same inverted pyramid, right, where there's a lot more older people than there are younger people. The life expectancy is rising, and the younger people have to sustain the older people, as you mentioned, by law. And then you've got the low retirement age that we mentioned earlier in the show, which is like 50 for women in manufacturing, 60 elsewhere, which is crazy for a country where people live to be 80 plus years old. And that is all falling on these younger generation. And then you're saying, by the way, we want you to have 3 kids, and they're laughing in your face because they see their own ability to live their own life go down the drain when they've got to support all these other people for like 30 years
Yeah.
before they croak, right?
Yeah.
And leave them nothing.
Well, and a very poorly developed pension system. So you're kind of doubly burdened. You're doubly burdened there. And because they favored men as baby boys over girls, guess who don't really take care of their parents, even when required to?
Right.
Baby boys.
Yeah.
Men do not take care of their parents at the same rate that women do. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot on that one.
Yeah.
Many households. So it's really it's a challenging situation, especially looking from the outside, having even spent time in China to understand how these are all kind of coming together. But there is one number that we look at, those of us who do economic work, called the dependency ratio. And the dependency ratio is people out of work versus people in work. And when that gets too far out of whack, the economy really starts to grind to a halt. And too many young people then are paying for either too many older people or too many other people that are out of work, social welfare, et cetera. This can really grind the gears of an economy. And when the dependency ratio is too high and the economy starts to slow down, it threatens things like the credit rating of a nation. And the credit rating of a nation, how could that be connected to demographics? Well, it's simple. If you can't pay your bills because you don't have enough people earning for you, you lose that number and you can't borrow. And you can't borrow at the same rate. You can't build bridges. You can't build hospitals. You can't build schools for the kids that are still being born. You can't build the ports that take your goods out to sea and to foreign markets. It all starts to really slip. That's where the challenge is for China right now, is because this is all happening at a very, very fast rate, and all the headwinds are coming for them at the same time.
And additionally, I don't think we touched on this, but China also has the outward migration problem. And I think since the UN has been compiling statistics, which I think is sometime in the 1950s, China has had a net negative number of migrants, meaning more people leave the country than arriving, and you only need to look around your whatever city you live in to probably verify that. And those people, despite what Chinese news sources might want to say, they're not interested in moving back from Vancouver to the suburbs of Beijing. They're not interested in leaving San Francisco because their grandparents were born in San Francisco. They're not going to China. If you ask them if they're Chinese, they're going to say, well, I mean, technically, yes, but not really. They don't. They've been American longer than my family has. The majority of them have. So the idea that they're just suddenly going to move back to China and then start speaking Mandarin, which they've never, their great grandparents spoke, maybe, or actually didn't, probably came from Hong Kong and spoke Cantonese anyways. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to have what Russia has, which is 100,000 people moving back from Kazakhstan to Russia because they speak Russian and they feel Russian and they came back after the Soviet Union. And China likes to sort of claim that those people are all Chinese and are eventually going to move back or just be Chinese. And it's like, you ask my neighbors across the street if they're Chinese, and they say, well, we're Asian, but like,
right.
We're not Chinese. It depends on what you're asking. They own a Chinese restaurant, but they're more American than my family, at least in terms of the time they've been here.
Right.
So,
well, the Chinese are in many ways the modern Irish. The Irish were exporting more people than they were bringing in, certainly during the Troubles and the potato famine. And we have this massive Irish population that exists here today. There's a massive Irish population that exists in the diaspora around the world, similar to China's today. Obviously, the numbers are different, but if the ratios are similar, you don't hear Irish people saying, I'm going back to Dublin.
No. Maybe for a vacation.
Maybe for a vacation, maybe a vacation property or a rental property. they might pop back, but for the most part, they've chosen another homeland, and they take on the identity of that homeland. That's part of the deal for immigrants. So getting those folks to move back is silly. It's silly.
So looking at these factors that we just applied to Russia and Russia having invaded Ukraine, do we think that China's going to get to the point where they turn saber rattling into action and invade Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like a war to distract people from the actual problems. And Russia has made it long known that it wants to reunify the empire at its peak. Mind you, the empire at its peak predates the Communist Party. So
you mean China, not Russia?
China wants to reunify its empire that predates the Communist Party, extends back to the Qing dynasty. There are significant swaths of land that they want. They want to take land from India. They want to take the land that we call Taiwan, and they want to take land that is outer Manchuria. They're what they consider to be outer Manchuria, that's home to Vladivostok. They believe this is all part of reunifying, quote unquote, Greater China and the Empire of China the way it should be. That saber rattling's already started. It's been going on for years. In fact, it was 74 when Nixon opened up China to the West. That one China policy was grounded in those conversations because they wanted the world to know that when they take back Taiwan, it's deservedly so. And that's why I think Taiwan is down to 3 countries that it has diplomatic relations with today that actually recognize it as a nation.
It's like Lithuania, United States, and
maybe Ecuador. It's one of the Latin American countries, but I think they may have just given that up. Regardless, our relationship with Taiwan has been really unique in the sense that we supply them with military goods. And if you've ever been there, they're highly acculturated in American life. Very friendly to America. It's actually one of the coolest places to be if you ever get to go to Taiwan because they have elements of Chinese culture, Japanese culture, and American culture all in one place. But we've committed to defend them, essentially, if anything happens. Now, will we actually at the end of the day? Hard to say. But Taiwan sits, about 100 miles off the coast of China. It's the equivalent of Cuba sitting off the coast of Florida and similar in size. So are we going to see China go after it? Maybe. Will it be a distraction from other bigger problems there? Yes. There's no reason for them to go after it other than political.
The thing that scares me is that she holds absolute power, which is what Putin has. And a lot of people in China who might say things to keep him in check are decamping or have left for the U.S., the Philippines, Singapore, Canada, Europe, wherever. And it's really, he's done all these, they don't call them purges, but people, the corruption investigation against 600 people who are kind of part of other factions of the CCP. But what's interesting, you mentioned that Ukraine was just like Russia in terms of demographics and decline. Taiwan is, I think, also even worse than any of them, right? It's the fastest aging country in the world, has the lowest birth rate, has extreme outward migration. It's the exact same kind of deal.
Exactly. The only country that has a lower birth rate than Taiwan is Korea. But Taiwan's birth rate is actually below 1 now. So on average, every woman there is having like three quarters of a child. Do the math in your head. Sounds kind of crazy when you say it. But that's reality. They've got incredible outward migration, very few people coming in, yet they've somehow been able to maintain a relatively healthy economy because they are doing good manufacturing and they do have good trade relationships. But from a population standpoint, going after Taiwan isn't going to buy China anything in terms of population growth. The specialty scientists, engineers, manufacturers that exist there will likely decamp should an invasion happen. The plant that's being built in Arizona right now to make semiconductors and microchips, that's owned in part by that Taiwanese company that makes the chips. So there are contingency plans in place, economic contingency plans in place should that invasion occur. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, of course, but I told Peter Zion on the show that there's probably 4,000 visas in a box somewhere for every Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company employee who works in that factory and their families. And there's probably housing built near this factory, and there's probably Chinese signs on the walls of that plant in Arizona. And if anything happens, there's going to be a few Airbus loads of people that just up and leave and end up spinning up production in the next 90 days. I mean,
you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that. You have to be a historian. And, take a look at our last major global conflicts, the Second World War. We pulled out every scientist, every thinker, every academic, every artist, and we brought them over here. That's what we did. That was part of the plan. That will likely be the plan for a place like Taiwan as well. We're not going to leave those types of people behind. Even in the fall of Kabul, we pulled out those people that were of highest value to us, those people that were the most loyal at the end of the day. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think it. It's a historical trend at this point. So maybe it's conspiracy to say there's a plan in place, but there hasn't been a conspiracy to do this in the past. We've done it, and we've done it without any hesitation or reservation.
India just passed China in population. Was it this month or last month or something like that?
It depends who you talk to, like all things. April's the month that most had estimated. The UN revised its numbers. When you get to talking about 3 billion people, being off by 1 or 2 months, I don't think is that much of a surprise. And we're also, splicing hairs now. But April was the date that most people had pegged when India would overtake China. And we're at that point right now. In fact, most of the major news outlets reported on it just a few weeks ago. UN is saying, I think, in maybe a few months. Regardless, it's happened. China deflates its numbers. China inflates its numbers, rather. India does kind of a poor job at counting in general. India's bigger now, period.
Is this important? I know, okay, they've sort of done the flippening, but does it matter? Is it because I'm assuming this is because the birth rate is crazy high in India. People still having kids like they're not going to survive.
So it is high, but it's not as high as you'd think. It actually fell below replacement rate last year.
That surprises me because when I think of a place that has a ton of kids, India's like right at the top of my stereotype list.
It surprises everyone, but they fell below replacement rate in December of last year. And the whole world, at least the whole world that does demographics, looks at economics and populations, had this collective gasp. I mean, we knew it was happening. But again, it's the pace in which it's happened is shocking. Just 10 years ago, India had birth rates that looked a lot like mid-century America, 3.5 children per woman. And now they're down to just under 2. Couple things are going to happen to see the population continue growing. Most of that is going to be extending lifespan for individuals. That's what's going to keep the numbers going up because India doesn't really have high immigration either. India is India, albeit a very diverse place. India is an Indian place. What makes India unique and I think different than China is that it has been part of the Commonwealth. So regardless of what your position is on British occupation or British colonial rule in India, they do have an English tradition there. They have a tradition of English business, and they have a tradition of liberal democracy. Despite its messiness, it is there, and it does work. And they have been an ally, although not a consistent one, of the Western countries, of the liberal democracies around the world. So the number of people does influence things because it will influence the cost of certain products and services, in particular services, because India is largely a service economy. You just think about the last time you picked up the phone and got an airline representative, and they're definitely not from here. They're from India. You don't pick up the phone and get an airline representative from China. So the cost of the service sector will actually decrease in the coming years. And I think you'll see a rush of business and investment into that area because of it. Just like you saw a similar rush of investment into places like the Philippines that have a long tradition of working and speaking in the English world.
We mentioned that with Russia's population decline, we might see Russia fracture into these different republics or whatever you want to call it, each with nukes. Not great. What do we think might happen with China since that population is declining as well? I mean, it could also happen where they fracture into little republics, right? There's different ethnic groups in there, but it's not as it doesn't seem as clean, if you can say that, as the Russian split might be.